we need to be the ones to give kids bad ideas first. We need to be telling them bad ideas before they encounter them in real life. You might think this is a wee bit unusual, but I want to use the example of a vaccine. A vaccine operates by putting a little bit of the disease into someone's body so that they learn how to fight it. And by the time the real thing comes, the deadly version comes, the body knows already how to fight it because it's been trained by the vaccine. In the same way, if we present to our kids bad ideas first with the point that they need to learn how to fend off these bad ideas, then by the time they encounter these bad ideas in real life, they'll know how to explain it. We live in a world where there is more access to information than ever before. Generations, young and old, are being exposed to radically different ideologies and opinions every day. It can be so overwhelming trying to decipher what's true and what's false. But there is a way. Join me as we discuss some of the toughest questions out there about Christianity, the Bible, and culture. I'm your host, Nick Lackey. Welcome to The Garrison. For those of you that don't know me personally, I work at a children's program, which means I get to spend a lot of time interacting with children and hearing what they have to say about certain issues. And one of these was Christianity. Now, I never really bring up the topic of Christianity around the children because it's a secular organization and I'm not really allowed to, but one child did it for me. And what was happening was I was sitting with a couple of boys and we were building, I think, guns or something out of some blocks. And one of them used these blocks and he created a shape which for him appeared to look like what he thought an idol would look like. And so he looked at his friend and he said, "Hey, this looks like one of those things that people worship and bow down to." And he started in a mocking way. He put the idol made out of blocks in front of him, and he started going hum, hum, and bowing down before it, and just being silly as a kid does. And he looks at his friend, and his friend says, "Man, I don't really believe in that kind of stuff. I'm not really religious, eh?" And so I think at this stage I asked him, I said, "Oh, well, what do you believe?" And he said, "Well, I believe everything came from the Big Bang and from science." And so I said, "Oh, well, where did the Big Bang come from?" And he said, "From the periodic table." And I said, "Well, where did the periodic table come from?" And he said, "Well, from the elements." And so I said, "Well, where did the elements come from?" And he said, "I don't know, from the periodic table." And look, clearly this is like a 7-year-old kid. He probably hadn't put a whole lot of thought into where the universe really had come from. But he was adamant that the universe had come from this Big Bang, which came from the periodic table, which came from the elements, which came from the periodic table, and so on. And so I just kept questioning him. I said, "Oh, well, it had to come from somewhere, didn't it?" And eventually he said, "Wait, do you believe in God?" And I said, "Yeah, I do, because I think that everything in this universe had to come from somewhere, and God is the best explanation." And so he started laughing at me, and he looked at his friend and says, "Wait, Nick believes in God," and they all had a good giggle about it. And another thing which happened was when I asked them, "Well, where does the periodic table come from?" They said, "Well, I don't know, our friend will know." And when the friend arrived, they ran over to him and said, "Wait, Nick believes in God," and they had another big giggle. And it was all pretty lighthearted as the children and stuff. But on a serious level, this is the attitude that kids in this generation of children were having towards Christianity. Now, this wasn't a Christian school, but I'd imagine the majority of students would be secular or had been raised that way. And another thing which happened, which I found quite funny, was this boy who was kind of having me on about believing in God. He said, "Wait, so do you believe that God had like 2 babies who created the whole world, like Adam and Steve or something?" Which made me chuckle. So I corrected him. I said, "No, it's Adam and Eve. And no, they didn't create everything. Rather, they were the first humans." And so anyway, the point I'm trying to make here in fact, this whole podcast episode that we're going to be doing right now has been inspired from this conversation, because while it was all kind of lighthearted at the time, on a serious note, children today are not getting the same level of education and exposure to Christianity as they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, and this is having an effect on our children. I'll share another story. I was working at the same program, and another boy, I was kicking a ball with him, and he kept saying OMG. He was blaspheming. And so I told him, I said, "Hey mate, like it's better if we just use this instead." And I offered an alternative, and I said, it's best not to say that. And obviously, I'm not going to bring up that blasphemy in the Old Testament was punishable by death. I'm not going to go that extreme on him, but I was just kind of showing him, hey, that's not the best thing to say. Let's try use something else. And instead of just listening to me, he said, well, why does it matter? Jesus wasn't real. And then he says, no one here is religious. And so, again, the attitude that young kids that at least I'm interacting with have towards Christianity is vastly different to what it was 10, 20 years ago. And so in this episode of The Garrison, I want to look into why this is happening and what we should be doing about it. I haven't actually welcomed everybody to the episode, so welcome everyone to this week's episode of The Garrison. If you haven't guessed already, we are going to be talking about children and about teaching our children about Christianity and apologetics as well. Reasons why Christianity is true. Now, if I've done everything right, I've set to release this on Christmas Day. So if you're listening on Christmas Day, Merry Christmas. I hope you're having a wonderful day, remembering Jesus and the wonderful gift that God has given us. If you're not listening on Christmas Day, then I hope you're still doing that, remembering Jesus, the wonderful gift that God has given us. Anyway, we will get into today's episode now. So with those stories out of the way, and having talked about, at least in my experience, a few interactions with children, I want to talk about why it's important we teach our children about Christianity from an early age. According to the TMW Center for Early Learning, they say children's brains are like sponges, absorbing everything going on around them. Every little thing they soak in builds connections in their brain. And they go on to say, brain development is most rapid in the early years. In other words, this is a prime time for children to be learning essential truths about the world that they live in. And it happens from very young ages. And from my example before, this kid who was 7 years old, he had it pretty firmly installed in him that the universe had come from some big bang, or it had come from the periodic table. And although it was unreasonable to think that, and while I asked him a pretty simple question, well, where did the periodic table come from? Even though I was asking him this question, he was pretty firmly holding on to this belief that God wasn't real and the universe couldn't have come from him. Now, public speaker Carol Fox says, psychologists believe that by the age of 7, most of our patterns of behavior, our beliefs, and our habits are formed. These beliefs are molded by the significant people in our life, especially our mother and father. And that's quite significant. By the age of 7, most of our patterns of behavior, beliefs, and habits, they're formed, or at least they're mostly formed. And you could see this in the conversation that I was having with this young boy. He was a 7-year-old, or maybe his 8-year-old, and he had pretty firm beliefs. Now, according to Families for Life, they say most core values are instilled in kids as early as 6 years old. With all that in mind, I mean, it's all really starting to make sense why this kid had such a strong opinion. And the point here is that kids learn things very quickly. They absorb it like a sponge from a very early age. So if we want to be teaching them truths about Christianity, we shouldn't be waiting until they're in their high school years or in their adult years. They need to be learning these truths from a very young age. Now, these beliefs will likely continue on into high school and young adulthood if they aren't challenged and shown to be wrong. So when these children who are in their 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 primary school age, if they have these core values and core beliefs, particularly that God isn't real, this is most likely going to continue on into high school. It's going to be probably confirmed by their non-Christian teachers and friends and culture mostly. And this belief will continue on into high school and young adulthood. And ultimately, we're going to see a whole generation of kids growing up without the belief that God is real. They're going to be growing up without hope of Jesus and what he's done for us. I want to read as well from pewresearch.org. They did a study and they say, indeed, in recent years, Christians have had a disproportionately large share of the world's deaths at 37%. In large part because of the relatively advanced age of Christian populations in some places. This is especially true in Europe, where the number of deaths already is estimated to exceed the number of births among Christians. In Germany alone, for example, there were an estimated 1.4 million more Christian deaths than births between 2010 and 2015, a pattern that is expected to continue across much of Europe in the decades ahead. Why is this significant? Well, more Christians are dying than being born. Now, obviously, you are not born a Christian, but being born into a family in which your parents are Christians, you will be more likely to grow up with this belief, and you'll probably hear the good news of Jesus and have the opportunity to respond. But we're seeing now that in the West, and I've talked about this a wee bit on my first ever podcast episode, the decline of Christianity in the West. We are seeing in the West a disproportionate amount of Christian deaths than births. More Christians are dying than people being born into Christian homes. And the exponential effect of this is that, you've got parents who teach their children things, and the children will most likely grow up holding these beliefs until they get to a point where they can probably think for themselves, and in which case they may change their beliefs. But in most cases, we tend to have similar beliefs to our parents, at least in the early parts of life. And if we are getting a whole lot of, if Christianity is on the decline, that means that there's probably going to be more parents who are non-Christian, who are going to be raising their children to be non-Christian, they themselves are going to grow up and raise non-Christian children, and so on and so forth. Now, here's the thing. Atheists will most likely produce more atheists in general. Okay, so you've got your non-Christian parent who has a kid and they raise them to be a non-Christian as well. But in contrast, Christians are hardly producing more Christians. What do I mean by this? Well, while we've got the atheists who are in general producing more atheists, Christians are not doing a great job of producing more lifelong Christians. Yes, kids might grow up in the church and hear this good news, but 2/3 of young people leave the faith when they leave high school. Between the ages of 18 and 24, 2/3 of young people are abandoning their faith. And so we've got a massive amount of kids who are growing up and getting to a stage, and I believe it's because we have failed to teach them in these early years, they get into a stage when they leave high school and then they abandon the faith. Now, I remember having conversations with friends in primary school about Christianity, and their beliefs and opinions had already been formed, and likewise, my ones had already been formed. Now, I'm at a stage now where I can completely think for myself, and I did honestly go and look into Christianity and think, man, is this just my parents' belief, or is this something which is genuinely true? And clearly, I have come to the conclusion that it is genuinely true. But I still had that belief when I was young. Now, I want to read a quote from C.S. Lewis on the Transmission of Christianity. This is what he writes. If we had noticed that the young men of the present day found it harder and harder to get the right answers to sums, we should consider that this has been adequately explained the moment we discovered that schools had for some years ceased to teach arithmetic. After that discovery, we should turn a deaf ear to people who offered explanations of a vaguer and larger kind. People who said that the influence of Einstein had sapped the ancestral belief in fixed numerical relations, or that gangster films had undermined the desire to get right answers, or that the evolution of consciousness was now entering on its post-arithmetical phase. Where a clear and simple explanation completely covers the facts, no other explanation is in court. If the younger generation have never been told what the Christians say and never heard any arguments in defense of it, then their agnosticism or indifference is fully explained. There is no need to look any further, no need to talk about the general intellectual climate of the age, the influence of mechanistic civilization, or the character of urban life. And having discovered that the cause of their ignorance is lack of instruction, we have also discovered the remedy. There is nothing in the nature of the younger generation which incapacitates them for receiving Christianity, if anyone is prepared to tell them they are apparently ready to hear. And man, that quote from C.S. Lewis really sums up what I'm trying to say in the podcast. I think the primary reason, and I think evidence backs this up, that Christians are leaving the faith normally around that 18 to 24 mark is that because as children they have not been told about it. Yeah, they may have heard that maybe God is real, but they don't know why God is real. Now, second point, the next generation, they will be hopeless if we don't do anything. If we aren't raising our kids in the faith, they will be a hopeless generation. We are responsible for this generation of children. We need to be raising them in the faith. It's not the job of someone else. It's primarily the job of the elders to teach the younger kids about Christianity. They're not just going to find out without someone telling them. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, it says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart." This is Moses speaking. "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Now, this is talking about the law and the commandments that God had given Israel. But God knew the importance of raising the next generation in the faith and of teaching them important truths. And so we should be doing the same. We can't rely on a Christian school to do it for us, or on our Sunday school, or on our youth pastor, or our children's worker. The primary responsibility lies on the parents or the caregivers. But if you aren't one of those things, you can still be doing all you can to contribute towards raising kids in the truth of Christianity. For example, I'm not a parent or a caregiver, but I still have a responsibility to the younger kids, particularly in my church, to be teaching them about Christianity and showing them why it is true. And I volunteer at kids camps as well, where I can share the good news about Christianity with younger kids. And I see that there's a massive lack of leaders around. There's a lack of people being willing to go and raise the next generation in Christianity. Now, if these kids grow up and they don't have solid roots, then the trials, the temptations, and tribulations will destroy them. As someone who's just gone through high school, man, high school is vicious. I mean, the pressure, the social pressure you get, pressure to go and fit in, to be involved in things like drinking and partying and sex, there is tremendous pressure from the culture of high school. And if kids haven't been raised with solid truths and don't have a clear conscience on these issues, they will crumble. And I've seen it happen with my own eyes. In many instances, kids will even leave the faith, or they'll be holding out for the moment they finish school, where they can leave home and they begin to be more independent, and they can stop going to church. These kids, they are also the future politicians and teachers and lawmakers of our country. They are the future parents of our grandchildren as well. We should be caring enough about them to teach them the truths of Christianity. Now, Jesus also loves children, and we see artists' impressions of him with children on his lap. When the disciples argue about who is the greatest in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus actually calls a little child onto his lap to represent humility. He then says, "But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea." What if, by neglecting to tell children about Jesus, we are inevitably causing them to sin? What would Jesus think about that? We know his attitude towards someone who causes someone to sin. But what if our neglection of explaining Christianity to them, what if that, down the line, causes them to sin, to fall away? So finally, we must be teaching our children apologetics. Proverbs chapter 22 verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it." Now, what should we teach them? Practically. Well, Cully J. Stigliano, I was reading an article, and this is what she said is important to teach children. Number one, about their sin and their need for a savior. This is very important. The gospel isn't the gospel if we don't talk about sin. Number two, the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection. Again, the gospel is not the gospel without these things. And finally, God's faithful presence in a believer's life. We should be teaching them about authentic relationship with God. Not just that God is real, but that God genuinely desires a relationship with us and he can be present in their life. So these were three things: their sin and their need for a savior, number one. Number two, the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection. And number 3, God's faithful presence in a believer's life. Now, Psalm 111, verse 10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," which goes to show that we must also be instilling a fear of the Lord. Now, when we say fear, we don't mean scaring our children and making God scary to them like a nightmare or anything like that, but rather teaching them to revere God as holy, as someone who is good, and someone who is not, he's not someone we want to be sinning against. To instill this reverence of the Lord in them, and then they will have the beginning of wisdom. I want to share another really important principle, I believe, from a guy called Tim Barnett, and he is an apologist, and he has raised children as well. And here's what he says. He asks his children what a unicorn is, and they will give the example out. They will give the description of a unicorn. It's like a horse with a horn and its head. And then he will ask what or who is God, and ask them to describe God, and they will give the explanation that they have been taught about who or what God is. Now, at this point, I'm going to quote him now. "At this point, we have described two different entities, a unicorn and God. Just as the students are able to describe what a unicorn is like, they are also able to describe what God is like." Now, here's the important thing. What to believe versus why to believe. Back to Tim. "Here's where things get interesting. After each description, I ask, how do you know that God is real? After all, how do you know that God isn't like the unicorn? Not real. When I ask this question to a room full of Christian kids, there are usually many puzzled faces. Many kids who have grown up in Christian homes have never entertained the idea that God is not real. They've never had to give a reason for why they think God exists. They've never had their beliefs challenged. Unfortunately, we are so focused on teaching our kids what to believe that we can forget to train them why to believe. Teaching the what without the why is like building a house without a foundation. It may stand for a season, but when the storms come, the house comes crashing down. Likewise, a faith that doesn't understand why it's true will not be able to withstand the challenges and doubts of life." And between those two quotes from C.S. Lewis and this one from Tim really goes to emphasize what I'm trying to say here. We must be teaching children not only that Christianity is true, but why it's true. Give them explanations. When kids go to school and they learn maths and reading and writing, they are learning what to believe, but why to believe it as well. And we can't be forgetting the why when it comes to teaching them about Christianity. Kids need to be taught what to believe and why. And here's the thing, if Christianity is really true, we don't need to fear that kids will go off and lose their faith if we teach them how to think and analyze truth. In fact, I would argue it's more important to teach them how to think and how to examine evidence and teaching them basic logic and reason, and naturally, this will probably lead them to coming to the conclusion that God is real. In other words, I don't have to teach my child, I don't have a child, but theoretically, I wouldn't have to teach my child that God is real, but rather if I taught them simple logic and reason, and they understood that something can't come from nothing, then they would come to this conclusion themselves, that there must be some bigger presence or being out there that caused us to exist. Now, Dave Mann, I've done a podcast with him. I can't remember what episode it is, but we talk about young people losing their faith. And he talks about this as well, about teaching kids from a young age about Christianity and why it is true as well. And I love the example he used. He said he's got kids and they were questioning whether God exists or not. And he shares this great analogy. What he did was he got his son to put all of his Lego bricks into a big bag, and then he asked his son to shake the big bag around. And he shook it for a wee while, and he said, well, can you see if anything has been designed yet? Has anything formed inside? And the child said no. And so he kept shaking it and shaking it and shaking it. And his dad, Dave, asked him, son, do you think if we gave 1,000,000 years of shaking that bag of Lego around, we would see something which appears to be designed formed? And the kid said, well, no, obviously not. We're not just going to it's not going to build like a Lego car or anything, or a Lego house, if we just keep shaking it, no matter how much time we get. And his point here was that If things appear to be designed, they probably are. And then he went on to show his child the design of humans and of many animals and things in our world. Went on to show what are called anthropic principles of the universe, how the universe appears to be designed as well. We need to be doing that with our children, giving them explanations why Christianity is true, as well as the fact that it is true in the first place, bringing that explanation with it. Now, another point I want to make before we wrap up is that we need to be the ones to give kids bad ideas first. We need to be telling them bad ideas before they encounter them in real life. You might think this is a wee bit unusual, but I want to use the example of a vaccine. A vaccine operates by putting a little bit of the disease into someone's body so that they learn how to fight it. And by the time the real thing comes, the deadly version comes, the body knows already how to fight it because it's been trained by the vaccine. In the same way, if we present to our kids bad ideas first, with the point that they need to learn how to fend off these bad ideas, then by the time they encounter these bad ideas in real life, they'll know how to explain it. For example, one bad idea I believe is that God is not real. So if I go to my child and I say, hey, some people in the world, they believe that God isn't real, but here's why that's not a logical thing to believe. And you equip your child with an answer. Now, obviously, go down to his level, talk about it in Lego terms like Dave did. And by the time that this child does encounter the bad ideas, they will know what to say and what to think. And most importantly, why to think that way. So in conclusion, children are a gift from the Lord. They bring us so much joy. And working in a children's program, I get so much joy from just interacting with them and seeing their little brains grow and develop and learn. But out of our love for them, we need to be equipping them with answers to the questions that they have. We need to be teaching them essential Christian truths and also why to believe these essential Christian truths. Otherwise, we're going to see a generation grow up without Christianity, without this hope. And ultimately, if you're a Christian, you'll know that if someone dies in their sin and they haven't accepted Jesus, they haven't repented and put their trust in Him, they'll end up in hell. And we can look at these children and think, oh, they're so cute and innocent, but now is the time to be teaching them. Out of our love for them, let's teach them apologetics. Let's teach them why Christianity is true. In a world which is chucking so much ideological rubbish at them from an early age, let's equip them with the truth that will counter the lies of the world. That's the point I want to make on this episode of The Garrison. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to leave a review or leave comments. Share it with people if you think that would be helpful. It all helps get the podcast out to more people. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next episode of The Garrison.